Hello there, and welcome to another one weekend recording with Alan D. Moore, in which I shall seek to move you, groove you, possibly improve you, with a piece of music conceived, recorded, and mixed in the space of one calendar weekend. In this episode, I present Acoustica. In the last episode, I composed a piece of music that might have been typical of electronic art music composers of the 1960s and 1970s. Synthesizers were certainly entering popular music at the same time, but mostly adding to the well-established instrumentation of rock and roll bands. By the 1980s, though, technological advancements such as polyphonic synthesizers, drum machines, MIDI, and software sequencing made it relatively easy and economical for pop musicians to make completely electronic music. Now, while some musicians just use this newfound capability to create poor facsimiles of existing instrumentation, like strings or horns, other styles of music began to develop around the very unique sounds and capabilities of these new electronic instruments. We often lump these together under headings like techno or electronica, but any true fan knows that there are dozens of genres and subgenres, each of them differentiated by things like the feel of the music or the particular sounds chosen, but all of them distinctly electronic. In this episode's piece, I wanted to create a piece of music that was very archetypically electronic dance music. However, I want to turn the tables on the synthesizers, where for so many years synthesizers have gotten flack for doing bad imitations of acoustic or traditional electric instruments. This time, we're going to use acoustic instruments to imitate all the electronic instruments in an otherwise distinctly electronic sounding piece. My first order of business on Friday were the drums. As with any popular dance music, the drums are the absolute foundation of the piece, and getting them right is crucial. In electronic dance music, probably the most iconic sounds you can think of come from two drum machines released in the early 1980s, the Roland TR-808 and TR-909. Although the names are very similar, each of these units has a very distinctive sound. The 808 used analog synthesis to generate drum sounds, so its sounds are not at all realistic. The 909 also uses analog synthesis for the drum sounds, but it has a slightly improved circuitry there, and it also uses sampling for the cymbals and the hi-hats. They're not terribly realistic either, but more so than the 808. With the sound of these two drum machines in mind, I got to work assembling an acoustic drum kit of my own. First up, the kick drum. The TR-808 kick drum is very recognizable. It's deep, it's boomy, it's got a definite sense of pitch about it. Sometimes it's overdriven, so it gets a crunchy, nasty, gnarly sound to it. I wanted to go for that. I started with my cajon. The cajon has a very similar tone quality if it's properly mic'd and played in a good room, but I wanted to take that up a notch. In the past, I've talked about using cardboard tubes to bring out resonant frequencies. This time I came across a cardboard tube I'd had that was about 8 to 10 feet long and the perfect size to stick into the sound hole of the cajon. So I did this and put a mic at the other end, and even without trying, it was already overloading the mic, so I had that crunchy distortion sound from the beginning. It turns out this tube resonates right around a C sharp, and with the distortion that created a definite tonality, so that kind of dictated the key of the song. We were going to be in C sharp. I went with a straight up trance style beat, which is just quarter notes on the kick drum. That goes nicely with the long boomy bass sound. The next stop was the snare drum. The TR-808 snare drum is sort of a little pop with some noise on it. I tried all kinds of things to get this sound. I thought I might get it from the cajon itself, but it just didn't quite have that nice pop to it. So I tried all kinds of objects and finally settled on a small packet of aluminum foil filled with lentils, of all things, sitting on top of a cardboard box about the size of a VHS tape. And when I hit this with a drumstick, it gave me just about the right tone and the right amount of sizzle from the foil and the lentils to give me that kind of tone. As a side effect, the foil packet bounced around on the box, so I got kind of an echo, which is not an uncommon effect to put on snare, so I just kept it. Third, I needed the hi-hat. The closed hi-hat sound on the TR-808 is a very tight metallic snap. It's very quick. It doesn't ring out or sizzle like a real hi-hat does. And I tried all kinds of metallic objects, but I happened to be out thrifting with my son Friday morning, and there, sitting lonely on a shelf, were these babies. Yeah, some musical spoons. And I knew this is exactly what I needed. They went home with me and sat in perfectly for that clicky, closed hi-hat sound. The last bit of the kit that I wanted to emulate was the crash cymbal. The TR-808 crash cymbal is thin, it's noisy, it's raspy, and it really sounds like nothing else on earth. Certainly not a real crash cymbal. So I must have beat on every metallic object in my house, trying to find the right thing that would give me this sound, and finally settled on this wire kitchen rack. Now, it didn't quite capture it, and it was very quiet, but I found that with some compression and a little bit of equalization to boost the high end, I was able to get something approaching a TR-808 crash cymbal. With my drum kit now assembled, I laid down the tracks Friday night and then spent a long time editing. I didn't want to make this robotic sounding, but I don't really pride myself on my drumming skills, so I wanted to make it at least listenable and at least regular enough to sound like the style of music I was going for. So I had to correct a lot of bad timing and slop on my part. And by the end of Friday night, I had something reasonably good. On Saturday, it was time to move on to the next instrument, the bass. The bass sounds in electronic dance music span the gamut from deep and mellow to snarling and bright, punchy, sometimes mushy, all kinds of things. So I had a lot of latitude in terms of what I needed to produce. Where I didn't have latitude was in the things that I had available to produce them. Unfortunately, I don't own an instrument that can produce bass tones acoustically. My only bass is electric, and apart from that, I've got synthesizers, and those are both out. I thought of all kinds of options of what I could do. Of course, I could have borrowed someone's acoustic electric bass. I thought about making a washtub bass. In the end, I was a little pressed for time, and I wanted to be able to do some expressive things with the tone. So I took the biggest bodied guitar I had, and I tuned down the bass string way down to a low A. Since my song was going to be in C sharp minor, and I decided on a pretty standard chord progression of 1, 7, 6. A was the lowest note that I really needed. So that worked out. You have to be careful doing this because, when you tune those strings so loose, the intonation is kind of shot. But I was only playing a few notes low on the fretboard, so it wasn't a huge deal. As I played the bass, I changed up the tone throughout the song in different ways. I would play muted with my palm resting against the strings for a real tight and deep tone. And then for a bright, wide open tone, I would play unmuted and pick very close to the bridge of the guitar. I also swept my hand from the bridge of the guitar across the sound hole and then into a palm muted sound to sort of simulate a filter sweep on the bass. You'll be able to hear that in the first breakdown section of the song when the drums cut out. With the bass squared away, I moved on to my comping sound. The comping instrument is usually an instrument that carries the chord progression and does so in a very rhythmic way. In some styles of electronic dance, you'll hear a piano with a really artificially hard attack. Other styles will use organ. Some use very stabby synth sounds, or maybe a synthesizer that's being gated so that it's very percussive. The point of this track, though, is that it's usually very staccato and percussive, and it communicates the chord progression. For this, I decided to use an acoustic guitar, but I made a few modifications. First of all, I used a 12-string guitar, but instead of the standard tuning, I used what's called the Nashville high-strung guitar. Now, this is something that's a common studio technique here in Nashville, of course, because of the name, to give you that bright jangle of a guitar, but without the heavy low end that you get from the low strings. Making a high-strung guitar is as simple as taking off the 3 lowest strings and replacing them with thinner strings tuned an octave up. So you have the same tuning, but without those low notes. I happen to have a 12-string guitar that I keep tuned this way. But I wasn't done. To give the guitar a more distorted flavor, I took a thin piece of plastic and wove it between the strings right next to the bridge of the guitar. This rattled against the strings as they vibrated. Also, to tighten up the sound, I dampened the strings by tying an old sock around the nut of the guitar. Finally, instead of playing with a pick or my fingers, I used a wooden stick and hit the strings like you might a hammer dulcimer. The result is a nice percussive comping tone. And now it's time for the hook. The hook is the main melody of an electronic dance piece. And in the case of trance music, which is kind of what this piece was leaning towards, it's usually played by a huge stack of big, bright sawtooth waves. This hook is usually introduced in the first breakdown of the piece, which is where the drums drop out. And it's usually introduced in a very simple way. After it's been introduced, it begins to be embellished, sometimes with harmonization, very often with an arpeggiated pattern. To simulate this instrument, I reached for that wonderful instrument that no home studio should be without, the melodica. The melodica is bright, it's full sounding, and it sustains just like, a great sawtooth synth patch. To get that big sound and those arpeggios, I recorded 4 tracks of the melodica itself. Some of them just doubling the melody, sometimes harmonizing the melody, and a couple of the tracks playing offbeat from the melody to create an arpeggiator effect. It took a lot of editing to get that to sound even kind of remotely smooth, of course, because the melodica, unlike a synthesizer, has some uncontrollable aspects about it. Overall, though, the melodica really fit well, and there wasn't a lot that I had to do to it in terms of mic techniques or weird acoustic effects to feel like it was fitting the bill. Now, things were sounding good at this point, but I wanted to give the listener a little break from the melodica because it does get tiring pretty quick. I decided that something bell-like would be a nice contrast there. I dug through our closets and found my wife's old glockenspiel that she played in marching band back in junior high, I think. I set my small diaphragm condenser inside the cajon, pointing downwards. I then set the glockenspiel on top of the cajon over the sound hole. Finally, I took my AT3035 and put it just about a foot away over the top. I panned each mic hard left and right, and then doubled my take with the mics panned opposite. So each take you get a combination of the mics, although slightly out of phase because of the difference in playing. And the end result is a nice stereo bell effect. At this point, I was out of ideas for instruments to track, so I turned my attention to mixing and editing. I did a lot of editing to clean up the melody parts and make sure things were lining up nicely. As far as mixing, I balanced out levels. I used a lot of compression on the kick drum particularly to rein it in because it was just swamping the whole track. On the bass as well, and used an expander to tighten up the melodica tracks. I went ahead and added some digital reverb because I really didn't think I was going to have time to do the whole room reverb thing that I did back on the Friday the 13th episode. And, okay, I'll admit it, I added a digital delay. I couldn't really help it. I mean, it's such an integral part of the trance sound and so many other electronic music styles, and there's just not really a good way to do that acoustically unless you're able to take your recording rig out to some very precisely placed mountains. Yeah, maybe it was cheating, but hey, I've come this far without touching a synthesizer, so I think it's okay. Listening to my piece on Sunday afternoon, I felt like it was good. It was almost there. It just needed a little bit more. And so I started casting around my collection of acoustic instruments to try to find out what that little bit more might be. The first thing I chose were my finger cymbals. I have a couple pairs of finger cymbals in different sizes that my brother bought for me in Turkey years ago. They're very, very loud and chimey and metallic, and so I thought they'd add a little extra brightness on the top end. I used them for a few hits here and there at the beginning of sections. They probably get kind of lost in the mix, but I think they add a little something. The next thing I found was this little Siren party whistle. You know, you can blow into these things and it makes a wee sound. If you breathe in and out and try to do rhythmic, strange things with it, you can get something that's sort of between a record scratch and what EDM producers call a Hoover sound, which is sort of a portamento synth that just makes out-of-tune noises. These added some neat elements to the track, but I knew that what my track was really missing was a pad. Now, a pad is usually a legato string-like sound that is just playing chords, and it's used to just sort of tie the harmony of a piece together. Now, the problem is I don't have anything acoustic that could really do a pad, and believe me, I tried all kinds of things. And then I happened to spy the family trumpet. I am the child of two very wonderful trumpet teachers, but I don't play trumpet. I try, and I can get notes out of it, but that's about all you can say. However, I felt like I could at least handle enough notes to play the harmony in this piece, but I didn't want it to sound like somebody playing a trumpet. I wanted it to sound, well, kind of pad-like, or at least not natural. So I reached for my trusty friend, the cardboard tube. I propped it up at an angle, kind of like a mortar, and stuck the microphone into the bottom end of the tube. Then, as I played each note of the trumpet, I started out pointed away from the end of the tube and slowly moved the trumpet until it was pointing right into the end of the tube. The result is kind of a swelling sound that almost sounds like a reverse trumpet. I played two tracks of this, an upper harmony part and a lower harmony part. I panned them each just a little bit left or right and bathed them in reverb and delay, and was pretty happy with the result. I have a lot of trouble playing the trumpet in tune, so it sounds a little out of tune, but maybe that's kind of cool. I mean, you know, electronic dance music gets a little funky like that sometimes. Well, in tune or not, my free time on Sunday was coming to a close, so it was time to print and ship. I hope you've enjoyed this little one weekend recording adventure. As always, if you've enjoyed this video, please do subscribe and leave your comments and questions below. Thank you very much for listening. I now leave you with Acoustica.